Hello everyone. It dawned on me this afternoon that I never answered the question regarding how to project shadows onto a scene so that our models actually look like they belong on the background image or whatever scene image we're using for our background, whether it's an image plane or through a sky dome. So I thought I'd put together this short tutorial to show you how to do this. In the scene that you're looking at, I have several pieces, mainly the geometry for the car, and then a polygon plane that we're going to use to capture our shadows. Both items, the polygon plane and all the geometry within the car, have currently a Lambert 1 material, so we are going to be replacing that by the materials that we will create for the scene. So let's get to it. First, I am going to select the body on the car, and I am going to apply a material to it by right-clicking on any of the parts, and I am going to assign a material. The material I will be assigning is a Arnold shader, and I am going for a standard surface material. That's the one that we've been working with in class. With that done, let me go ahead and apply a paint material preset to that material. So I'm just going to go into the presets drop down, and I'm going to replace with car paint. So that is the material that we will be applying to the car body. Then I'm going to create an Arnold sky dome, and for that sky dome color channel, I am going to import an image under the render node, an actual file. For this file, I will be using the JPEG that I gave you guys in class, the one that is called car panorama. That is a 360 image, HDRI image, and I had given you guys a JPEG. Now, when you import this file into one of the render nodes for Arnold will translate that image into a file format called .tx. And that is, it basically calculates the gamma values of the image. JPEG by default has lower gamma values, and it pumps it up slightly, and actually it increases the size of the image significantly so that the image can actually be used to project energy or light. And so because this is being applied to the sky dome, that makes sense. Now, if you don't have a TX file with you, that doesn't matter. Whatever you apply to that particular node will be translated by Arnold into a TX file format. So since I already have my TX format, I've used this in the past, I will go ahead and use that. Click open. And now if I rotate my scene, you'll notice that it's that parking structure HDRI that I had given you in class. Now let me zoom out slightly from this so that I can see where my light source is in this scene. And by looking at the shadows, I can tell you that the sunlight is directly above our scene. So that's where my main light source for my scene should be coming from. So let's go back to where we were roughly. And let me go ahead and do a quick render. So I'll click on Arnold, render, and that will open up the render view for Arnold. And as you can see, I have my scene is lit by the background because the sky is blue. That's the light that is being projected on the car and on the plane, and it's pretty dim. So before we start playing with that specific light, all I really need that light for is to create the specularity in the car and to start bringing up those values. Also notice that I am really not relying on the light per se on the image. Since I'm keeping it this dark, I'm going to be using something different. What I really want to know is if this is projecting shadows, and as you can see under the car, it is actually projecting shadows onto that plane. So what we want to do now is apply a material to that plane that captures the shadows only. And for that, we're going to go into our hypershade by clicking on the little blue dot on our menu bar, open up your hypershade window, and under the hypershade filter, I am going to start typing the word shadow. You will notice that it filters out to something called AI Shadow Matte. When I click on that, I add it up here onto my materials list. And then what I want to do is I want to select my floor, my poly plane, and then I want to right click on that shader that I just created in the hypershade. Right click on it, and then from the flyout menu, go to assign material to selection. Now what that does is it tags that item. This material, all it does is it captures the information on shadows and drops everything else. So it makes everything else transparent. I'll close my hypershade right now, and I can tell that I can still see some of the shadow under the car. Not very strong shadow, but that's okay. I just really need the information right now to know that the shadow is being projected. So with that setup, then what is truly projecting the highlights, the specularity on the image itself right now is the sunlight, which happens to be at the top of the image, as we saw at the beginning of the tutorial. So I am going to fake my sun by using a spotlight. And to do that, I'll go ahead and let me close this really quick. And I'm going to go to my rendering shelf, and I am going to click under spotlight. Now let me switch my tool to the move tool so that I can pull it up and see if it's there. There's my spotlight. I will be rotating this -90 on the x-axis so that my light is pointing down, as you can see. And then I'm going to switch back to my move tool, and I'm going to move this on the y-axis to a value of about 10 so that I pull that light further up. Now let me go ahead and regenerate a render for this. I'm going to open up the rendering window for Arnold, and as you can see, I am now projecting very sharp shadows under the car. My goal now is to match the shadows in the background. As you can see, there is some kind of influence light by light bouncing on the actual image that makes this area of the street look a little bit lit. You can see a bluish hue to it, so I need to manipulate my lighting and my shadow to actually work my shadow to look like that. Number one. Number two, my image is still pretty dim, and the reason for that is because my spotlight is way up, up above my scene. You can barely see it. Let me pull out, and there it is. It's right here. So the light is fairly high up. And number three, I haven't played with that light. I literally just dropped it. So what we need to do is actually go in and start playing with the settings for that light. But even with just this very bad results right now, I can see that the shadow is projecting, almost making it look like the car belongs within the scene. So with that done, let me go ahead and select the spotlight on my outliner and go to its attributes editor. And what we're going to be focusing on is, number one, the intensity and the type of decay that this light is projecting. And then we're going to scroll down to the Arnold dropdown to work out the issue with the shadows, to actually control the shadows. So first things first, let's go ahead and change our decay rate to quadratic, because lights in Arnold are quadratic. They are actual real life lights. And then the next thing I'm going to do is scroll down to my Arnold settings within the light. I am going to increase the exposure, which will automatically make things look brighter. So if I change this value to, say, about 5, you should see that there's more light coming into the scene. Also notice that my shadow is not affected by that increase on exposure. Let me also increase the intensity. So I'm going to scroll back up and increase the intensity of this to about 5 as well. And I'm getting better lighting right now. So my intensity is 5 on the spotlight, and my exposure is 5 as well in the Arnold settings. I could actually reduce my exposure down back to 0 and increase the intensity significantly. But for the purposes of what I'm showcasing right now, this is a good balance. Now, what I want to do is I want to make my shadows softer, almost to match the ones back here in the image. So to do that, we change the radius of our light. And for that, I'm going to go to the radius value of the spotlight, and I'm going to enter a value of, let's say, 5. And just changing it to 5 makes everything extremely smooth. Actually, a bit too smooth if you ask me. It almost looks like this is being lit by studio lighting and not by actually a spotlight that is at the top. So I want to make that significantly smaller, and I am probably just going to add a value of 2. And 2 gives me enough softness around the edges that it starts to match that of the background. The second thing I notice is that my shadow is quite dark compared to the one in the back. You control the amount of shadow by changing the shadow intensity under the Arnold settings. So for this, I would say a value of 0.7 would be sufficient, and that mimics light bouncing off the undercarriage of the car and onto the pavement, and so you actually see some light being transmitted under the car, which is what shadows look naturally like in the real world. Now, you can actually increase that slightly if you want to, or decrease it depending on what your setup is. And right now, 0.7 seems to be a good number. Let me just increase it to 0.8 to give a little bit more oomph to that shadow. I will also change my smoothness from 2 to 1.5 for the radius. And I will also be increasing the amount of samples for volume. Let's increase that from 2 to 5. And I'm going to increase the amount of samples for my actual specularity for the highlights from 1 to 5 as well, just to get better lighting on the scene. More samples being captured by the renderer. So as you can see, this is starting to look pretty good on the scene. I get a very sharp highlight from my light. If I don't like that sharp highlight, what I can do is, if I keep on scrolling down on my light settings under Arnold, there is an area called visibility. And these are different channels that affect these different attributes for the light with regards to what is being rendered within the scene. So the diffuse channel affects the amount of color that is being projected or illuminated by the light. So if I bring this down, basically the overall lighting on my scene should come down. As you can see, my color is not being lit as much as possible. What I really want to reduce is my specularity. My specular right now is pretty high because that's what we wanted on the car paint, but it's making that light look almost like an actual light. It's not making it look like the sunlight that is supposed to be hitting the car. So I can go ahead and reduce that to give that impression of subsurface scattering. Another thing I can do is bring down the subsurface scattering. There's no subsurface scattering in the car paint right now. I'll keep the indirect and volume lights up, and this should accelerate my render time. So with that set up, I can now go back and start fine-tuning those same settings that we've been working with until we get something that is pleasing or that's matching what we're looking for. By the way, this still gives you control over the color temperature for your shadows and everything else. So if you want to add the bluish hue to it, you can actually go in and start working temperature into your shadows or into your lights, sorry. Let me go ahead now and rotate my scene, and you'll notice that the shadows make it look like the car is actually part of the scene. Okay. If you want to keep on playing with these settings until you match what you're looking for, do so. Now, the key thing here is that, as you notice, I am maintaining my camera above the actual model. And the reason for that is because even though I'm moving around and it's matching pretty well, my model and my shadow catcher, my plane, they are smack in the middle of the scene. So, and the background is a spherical background that goes all the way down to almost 70,000 centimeters. So if I rotate, it will start looking like my item is floating, and that's not what we're going for. So make sure that when you're capturing the stills, or if you're doing an animation, it's all captured from slightly above the top of the bottom of the ground, not from anywhere close to it actually, so that you maintain the natural look of the shadows with respect to the lighting on the scene. Hope this answers the question from yesterday.